The encounter. The air was sharp with the chill of impending winter as Nathaniel stepped out of his office at Miller and Stark Associates, a prestigious law firm that stood tall in the heart of the city. His fingers wrapped tightly around the handle of his leather briefcase, but he couldn't shake the ache he felt in his chest. The day had been long and grueling. Drafting contracts, scheduling depositions, endless paperwork. It was work he had grown used to, but something was different tonight. A haunting thought nagged him, pulling his focus away from his usual routine. He walked his familiar route down Oak Street, past the bustling cafes and bakeries that spilled warm light onto the cold sidewalk. But tonight, like every night for the past week, his gaze was drawn to a young girl huddled by the old bakery, her thin frame almost blending with the shadows that pooled around her. She was barely a teenager, he guessed, no more than 12 or 13, wrapped in a jacket that looked 2 sizes too small and thin enough to be useless against the November chill. Her hair, a tangle of dark curls, partially obscured her face, but he could see her eyes, deep, guarded, and scanning the ground, as though counting every crack in the pavement to avoid meeting the gaze of passersby. Each time he had walked by, he'd wrestled with himself, tempted to approach, to offer help, but every time, he'd convinced himself that someone else would step in. But tonight, as the cold gnawed at him even through his heavy coat, he couldn't ignore her plight any longer. Taking a deep breath, Nathaniel crossed the street to Joe's Diner, a small old-fashioned eatery that smelled of freshly brewed coffee and warm bread. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and within minutes he walked out with a steaming paper bag filled with a hot chicken sandwich, a bowl of soup, and a large cup of hot chocolate. His hand shook slightly as he approached her, not from the cold but from an unspoken worry of how she might react. When he finally reached her, he stopped a few paces away, clearing his throat softly to avoid startling her. "Excuse me," he said, his voice gentle but loud enough for her to hear over the traffic. "I noticed you've been here a while. Would you like something warm to eat?" She looked up slowly, her dark eyes searching his face, filled with a mixture of surprise and wariness. Her fingers, red and raw from the cold, hesitated before reaching out for the paper bag he extended toward her. Nathaniel watched as her expression softened ever so slightly when the scent of the hot food met her nose. "It's still hot," he assured her, offering a small, reassuring smile. "Joe's Diner has the best soup in town." After a few seconds, she took the bag, her hands closing around it with surprising gentleness. Her gaze fell back to the ground, but not before she managed a faint, almost inaudible "thank you." "You're welcome," he replied, keeping his voice soft. "I'm Nathaniel. I work at the law firm down the street. Do you, mind if I sit here for a while?" She shrugged, her attention shifting back to the food in her lap, and began to eat in small, careful bites, as though savoring every taste. As he watched, Nathaniel couldn't help but feel an inexplicable weight lifting from his chest. In his 10 years at the firm, in a job that often felt cold and transactional, he had rarely felt this sense of purpose. After a few quiet moments, he asked softly, "Do you have somewhere to stay? Somewhere warm?" The question hung in the air, fragile and loaded with concern. She paused mid-bite, her fingers clutching the sandwich tightly. For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer, but then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not really. Used to have, but not anymore." The simple statement hit Nathaniel like a gust of cold wind. He didn't press her for details. It was clear enough that her story was complicated, and her trust would not be easily won. "I'll bring you something warm again tomorrow," he said, his voice thick with emotion he hadn't anticipated. "Would that be okay?" The girl looked up, meeting his gaze for the first time. Her eyes, though guarded, held a glimmer of gratitude, and she nodded slowly. "Same time?" he asked, standing up and brushing the cold from his trousers. She nodded again, wrapping her hands around the cup of hot chocolate. "Same time," she murmured. As he walked away, Nathaniel's mind was already on the next evening's meal. planning how he could make it even better. A growing bond. The following day, Nathaniel found himself distracted. His thoughts kept drifting back to the girl he'd met on the street, replaying the brief encounter like a scene from a film. Her haunted eyes, her small, careful bites of the sandwich, the way she hugged the hot chocolate cup to her chest for warmth. All of it stuck with him. He wanted to help her, but he also knew that trust was fragile, easily broken by a single wrong move. When evening came, Nathaniel left work earlier than usual, feeling a sense of urgency he couldn't quite explain. He went straight to Joe's diner. But tonight he opted for a heartier meal, a steaming chicken pot pie, a slice of warm apple pie, and a hot cider. The scents wafted up from the bag, and he hoped it would bring her a bit of comfort against the creeping cold. As he exited the diner, his gaze instinctively moved across the street, searching for her familiar figure against the wall. There she was, huddled against the brick, just as she had been every night. Her backpack, worn and fraying, was clutched tightly to her side. She didn't see him at first, her head tucked down as if trying to disappear from the world around her. Nathaniel felt his heart ache. He approached slowly, mindful of not startling her, and cleared his throat once he was close enough. "Hello again," he said softly, offering her a small smile as he held up the paper bag. Her head lifted at the sound of his voice, and a faint flicker of recognition crossed her face. She glanced down at the bag, and though she tried to hide it, he saw a hint of relief and gratitude in her eyes. "I brought something different tonight," he said, handing her the bag. "Chicken pot pie and apple cider. It's still warm." She took the bag from him, her fingers curling tightly around it. For a moment, she just held it, the warmth radiating through the paper and into her hands. She murmured a quiet thank you and opened the bag slowly, as if savoring the smell before she even took a bite. Nathaniel waited a few moments before sitting on a nearby bench, giving her enough space to feel safe while staying close enough to talk. The silence between them stretched comfortably, and he noticed her shoulders relax slightly as she began to eat. "How was your day?" he asked gently, not expecting much of a reply. She shrugged, taking a small sip of the cider. "Same as usual," she said softly, avoiding his gaze. Nathaniel nodded, respecting her boundaries. "I understand," he said. "I know this might sound strange, but I really don't think anyone should be out here alone in the cold like this. I worry about you." A faint shadow crossed her face, and she looked down, her expression unreadable. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm used to it." The sadness in her words struck him deeply, and he felt a surge of empathy. "I understand," he said quietly, "but just so you know, I'll be here every evening if you want some company, or a warm meal." She didn't reply but continued eating, her guarded posture softening ever so slightly. As the minutes passed, he felt that familiar ache of helplessness. He wanted to offer her more than food, perhaps a way out of this situation entirely. But he also knew that pushing too hard could scare her off. Trust had to be earned, especially with someone who had likely learned to rely on no one but herself. They sat in silence for a while, the sounds of the city humming around them. Cars rushed by, people hurried along the sidewalks, and the city lights cast a soft glow that mingled with the early winter darkness. Nathaniel glanced at her, observing the way her eyes focused intently on her food, as if she were afraid it would disappear if she looked away. He chose his next words carefully, hoping not to overstep. "Do you, mind if I ask your name?" he asked, keeping his tone light. She looked up, hesitating for a moment, and then mumbled, "It's Veronica." A warmth spread through him, a small victory. She'd shared her name. "That's a beautiful name, Veronica," he said, offering her a warm smile. "Thank you for telling me." Veronica gave a tiny nod, her eyes drifting back to her meal. It was clear she wasn't used to compliments, and it struck him that someone so young should be carrying such a heavy burden. He wanted to ask her more, to understand her story, but he held back, sensing that it wasn't yet the time. After a few more bites, she finally spoke, her voice barely audible over the city noise. "You don't have to keep bringing me food, you know," she murmured, her eyes not meeting his. "I can manage on my own." Nathaniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I know you're strong, Veronica. I can tell," he said sincerely. "But sometimes, it's okay to let people help. I'm not here to take anything from you. I want to make sure you're safe and warm, at least for a little while." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to gauge the truth in his words. For a fleeting moment, he saw something in her gaze, a softness, a hint of vulnerability that she quickly masked. "Why?" she asked suddenly, her voice laced with suspicion. "Why do you care?" Nathaniel paused, taken aback by the intensity of her question. He hadn't prepared an answer. He had simply acted on impulse, driven by an instinct to help. After a moment, he looked at her, his expression earnest. "Because I can't stand the thought of you being out here alone," he admitted. "I know life can be hard, and sometimes people fall through the cracks. I want to make things a little better, if I can." Veronica's gaze softened for a brief second before she looked away. "Most people don't care," she muttered, her tone almost bitter. "They just walk by, like I'm invisible." Nathaniel felt a pang of guilt, realizing he had almost been one of those people. "Maybe they don't know how to help," he offered gently. "But you're not invisible, Veronica. Not to me." She didn't respond, but he noticed her shoulders relax just a bit more. They sat in silence for a while longer, with only the sounds of the city filling the air. Finally, Veronica finished her meal, carefully wrapping the empty containers and placing them back in the bag. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. This time, there was a genuine warmth in her tone, a flicker of gratitude that went beyond politeness. Nathaniel nodded, his heart feeling lighter than it had in days. "Anytime," he replied. "I'll see you tomorrow." Veronica hesitated, glancing down at her worn backpack. After a moment, she nodded. "Same time." He smiled. "Same time." As Nathaniel stood and began walking away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was meant to be here, to be part of her life in some way, however small. His thoughts swirled as he imagined what her life might have been like, what circumstances had led her to this cold street corner. He knew he couldn't solve all her problems, but perhaps in these small acts of kindness, he could give her a sense of hope, a reminder that she wasn't alone in the world. The night air felt a little less biting as he made his way home, his heart warmed by the thought of tomorrow and the chance to see her again. He couldn't quite explain it, but he felt a purpose that had been missing from his life, a new sense of meaning in this unexpected friendship. Breaking down walls. The next evening, Nathaniel's anticipation was tinged with a strange mixture of excitement and nervousness. He had planned out tonight's meal with extra care, choosing a homemade stew from a family-owned restaurant known for its generous portions and savory dishes. Along with the stew, he brought a side of fresh bread rolls and a thermos filled with creamy hot chocolate. As he made his way to their usual meeting spot, Nathaniel's mind was filled with thoughts of Veronica. She was like a puzzle, each small interaction revealing a new piece of her story. He knew she had lost her mother, and he could only imagine what hardships had followed. But beyond the facts, there was an undeniable resilience in her, a quiet strength that reminded him that she was more than just a homeless girl. She was a young person trying to survive in an unforgiving world. When he reached the corner, he was relieved to see her already there, sitting against the wall with her backpack in her lap, looking slightly less guarded than before. Tonight, she had layered her thin jacket with a hoodie he hadn't seen before, though it still looked too light for the plunging temperatures. Nathaniel approached her with a warm smile, holding up the paper bag. "Good evening, Veronica," he greeted her. "I hope you're hungry." She looked up, her eyes scanning him as if still unsure what to make of his persistent kindness. But after a moment, she nodded, offering him a faint smile. "What's in there?" she asked, nodding toward the bag. "Beef stew," he replied, sitting on the bench beside her, though he kept a respectful distance, "and some fresh bread rolls. Plus, I brought hot chocolate tonight. Thought you might like something sweet to go with it." Her eyes brightened slightly at the mention of hot chocolate, and she reached out for the bag with a bit more eagerness than she had shown in previous nights. Nathaniel handed it over, watching as she unwrapped the containers and took in the scent of the food. For a moment, her face softened, and he could see just how young she truly was, her defenses melting away as she focused on the warmth of the meal in her hands. "Thank you," she murmured, almost as if to herself, before dipping a spoon into the stew. She took a small taste, then another, and Nathaniel could see her visibly relax as the warmth spread through her. After a few moments of silence, she spoke, her voice cautious but curious. "Why do you keep coming back?" she asked, her gaze fixed on the stew. "You don't even know me." Nathaniel leaned back slightly, considering her question. It was something he'd asked himself as well, and the answer was complicated. "I suppose I don't have a simple answer," he admitted. "But I guess I couldn't just walk by and do nothing." "You reminded me of someone." Her eyebrows lifted slightly, and she glanced up at him, her expression skeptical. "Who?" "My younger sister," he replied, smiling softly at the memory. "She passed away a few years ago. She was a lot like you. Strong, resilient, and a bit of a fighter." He chuckled lightly. "She never let anyone tell her what to do." Veronica's expression softened, and for a moment, she looked down, as if processing his words. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "Thank you," he replied, touched by her empathy. "I think she'd have liked you." Veronica shifted uncomfortably, as though she wasn't used to people speaking to her with such openness. She took another sip of the hot chocolate, her eyes drifting back to the street. They fell into a comfortable silence, interrupted only by the sounds of the city around them. Nathaniel found himself watching her, wondering what life had been like for her before this. It was clear that she had once had a home, a family. He wanted to know more, but he didn't want to pry. After a few more bites, Veronica spoke again, her tone more vulnerable than he'd heard before. "I didn't always live like this, you know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathaniel looked at her gently. "I didn't think you did," he replied softly. "You don't have to tell me if you're not ready." She hesitated, looking down at her hands before continuing, as if the words were being drawn from a place she kept locked away. "My mom and I, we had a small apartment. It wasn't much, but it was home." Her voice wavered slightly. "Then she got sick, really sick. It was just the two of us, and when she was in the hospital, I didn't know what to do. I was so scared." Nathaniel's heart tightened, his empathy deepening with every word. He nodded, encouraging her to continue without saying a word. "When she passed," her voice cracked, and she took a deep, shaky breath. "I was sent to live with an aunt I'd never met, and she didn't really want me there." Veronica looked away, her face hardening. "She made it clear from day one that I was just a burden. Eventually, things got so bad. I left." Nathaniel felt a rush of anger, tempered by sadness. He couldn't fathom how anyone could treat a child that way, especially one grieving the loss of her mother. But he kept his face calm, not wanting to burden her with his own emotions. "That must have been so difficult," he said gently. "You've been through a lot, Veronica. More than anyone your age should ever have to handle." She nodded, her gaze distant. I thought I could manage on my own. But it's harder than I expected. Some days, I don't know how much longer I can do this." Nathaniel's chest tightened. He could see the weight of her struggles etched in her face, in the way she held herself as if bracing against an invisible storm. He wanted to help her, to offer her a way out, but he knew that she might not be ready to accept it yet. Trust, he reminded himself, was a fragile thing. "Veronica," he began slowly, choosing his words carefully, "you don't have to be alone. There are people who want to help. I'm here because I want to see you safe and happy. And there are other resources, places that can give you shelter and support." She stiffened slightly, her defenses rising once more. "I don't need charity," she muttered, her voice tinged with defiance. "I'm not some helpless kid." Nathaniel held up his hands in a calming gesture. "I know that, and I respect your strength, I really do. But sometimes, even the strongest people need a little help. It doesn't make you weak, it just makes you human." She didn't reply, but he saw her expression soften, her defiance giving way to a flicker of vulnerability. She took another sip of the hot chocolate, her gaze distant, as if considering his words. "I'm not saying you need to decide anything right now," he continued gently. "Just know that the offer stands. I'll be here, whether you need a meal, a friend, or even just someone to talk to. No strings attached." Veronica glanced at him, her expression a mixture of skepticism and something else, perhaps a glimmer of hope. She nodded slowly, not quite trusting him fully but not dismissing his words either. As they sat together in the fading light, Nathaniel felt a growing sense of purpose. Each evening, their connection deepened, and with every shared meal, he could feel her walls beginning to crack, revealing glimpses of the person she was beneath the armor she wore. He didn't know what the future held, but he was determined to be there for her, to offer her the stability she had been denied for so long. As she finished her meal, Veronica looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. "Thank you, Nathaniel," she said quietly, her tone carrying a weight of sincerity that took him by surprise. "For everything." He smiled warmly, his heart full. "You're welcome, Veronica. I'll see you tomorrow." She hesitated, but then nodded, a small, tentative smile breaking through her usual guarded expression. "Same time," she replied. As he walked away that night, Nathaniel felt a profound sense of gratitude. In this small act of kindness, he had found a purpose he hadn't known he was missing, and in Veronica's reluctant smile, he saw a glimmer of hope, a sign that perhaps, one day, she might let him in completely. Until then, he would be patient, ready to stand by her side in whatever way she needed. Unveiling the past. The following evening, Nathaniel's steps felt lighter as he made his way to their meeting spot. Each day he spent with Veronica seemed to chip away at her walls, and he could see a glimmer of trust forming between them. Tonight, he brought something a little different, a lasagna from an Italian restaurant he loved, along with a Caesar salad and a slice of cheesecake for dessert. It was a meal meant to bring warmth and comfort, a reminder of the kind of dinners he used to have with his own family. When he arrived, he found her waiting, leaning against the wall with her arms crossed, looking almost as if she had been expecting him. Her posture was a little more relaxed than usual, her eyes softening as she saw him approach. Nathaniel held up the bag, smiling. "Lasagna tonight," he announced, and he thought he saw a spark of excitement in her gaze. "Lasagna, huh?" she said, trying to sound casual, but he could see the anticipation in her eyes as she took the bag from him. She sat down on the bench nearby and carefully opened the containers, a small smile playing on her lips as she inhaled the scent of the warm, cheesy meal. "It's my favorite," Nathaniel admitted, sitting beside her, keeping his usual respectful distance. "My mom used to make it for us every Sunday. There's just something comforting about it." Veronica glanced at him, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "Did you have a big family?" she asked, surprising him with her question. He nodded, feeling a pang of nostalgia. "Yeah, I have 2 sisters and a younger brother. Sundays were our family day. My mom would cook for hours, and we'd all sit around the table and talk about everything and nothing." Her expression softened, and she looked away, focusing on her food. "Sounds nice," she murmured, almost to herself. "It was," he replied, watching her closely. "Do you remember anything like that from before? Everything changed." She was silent for a moment, her gaze distant as if lost in memories. Finally, she nodded slowly. "My mom and I used to do that. It was just the 2 of us. But we'd have little traditions. Friday nights were movie nights. We'd get takeout, sometimes pizza, sometimes Chinese, and just be together. She loved those silly romantic comedies. She gave a faint smile, then quickly looked away, her expression hardening. But that was a long time ago. Nathaniel felt the ache in her voice, the weight of loss and memories too painful to hold on to but too precious to forget. He wanted to reach out, to comfort her, but he knew that offering comfort to someone so guarded required patience and sensitivity. "You know," he said, after a pause, "it's okay to remember the good times. They don't have to hurt so much eventually." Veronica shook her head, her jaw tightening. "Remembering just makes it harder. Every time I think of her, I get angry. It feels unfair." Her voice grew sharp, laced with a frustration that seemed to come from deep within. "Why did she have to get sick? Why did she have to leave me alone?" Nathaniel let her words hang in the air, understanding the depth of her pain. "Life can be so unfair," he agreed quietly. "It's not right, what happened to you. But I think, sometimes, holding on to those memories, even the painful ones, keeps a part of her with you." Veronica's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, and she looked down, clenching her fists. "I know she didn't want to leave me," she whispered, as if trying to convince herself. "But I missed her so much. I don't even know how to live without her." Nathaniel felt his throat tighten. He reached out, letting his hand rest lightly on the bench beside her, not touching but offering silent support. "That's okay, Veronica. Missing her, feeling lost, that's all part of it. You don't have to have it all figured out right now." She was quiet for a long time, eating slowly, as though each bite gave her something to hold on to. Finally, she looked at him, her gaze filled with vulnerability that she rarely showed. "Have you ever lost someone you loved?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Nathaniel nodded, his heart heavy with memories of his sister Anna. "Yes, I have. My younger sister passed away a few years ago. It was sudden, unexpected. She was so full of life. And then, she was just gone." He paused, his voice thickening with emotion. "For a long time, I didn't know how to go on. I kept wondering why it had to happen, why she was taken so young." Veronica looked at him, her eyes wide, and he saw something soften in her. How did you deal with it?" He took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "Honestly, I'm not sure if I ever truly dealt with it. It was hard, but I learned that grief isn't something you get over. It's something you carry with you. Over time, it becomes a part of who you are, and you learn to live with it." He glanced at her, offering a small, sad smile. "Sometimes, you just have to take it one day at a time." She seemed to take in his words, her face thoughtful. "I've tried to be strong, to keep going, to survive. But it gets so tiring." Her voice cracked, and she quickly wiped away a tear that had slipped down her cheek. "Some days, I just want to give up." Nathaniel's heart ached at her words. He could see the battle she was waging within herself, the constant fight to survive in a world that had shown her little kindness. "You're strong, Veronica. Stronger than you know. And it's okay to lean on others sometimes. We all need help, even if we don't like to admit it." She looked at him, her gaze filled with a mixture of gratitude and skepticism. "I don't know how to trust people anymore," she admitted. "Everyone I thought cared about me either left or pushed me away. So what's the point in trusting anyone?" Nathaniel let out a soft sigh, understanding her reluctance. "I can't blame you for feeling that way," he said gently. "When people let us down, it's hard to open up again. But maybe trust doesn't have to be all or nothing. It can start small, like with us." Veronica hesitated, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to find some hint of deception. "Why do you care so much, Nathaniel? I'm just some girl on the street. You don't owe me anything." He took a deep breath, considering his words carefully. "Maybe I don't owe you anything, but I want to be here. I see something in you." A truth revealed. The days had turned colder, and a hint of winter had crept into the late autumn air, the kind of chill that clung to the skin and made the bones ache. Nathaniel had become a fixture in Veronica's life now. Each evening, without fail, he would show up with a warm meal, and they would sit together, talking about anything that Veronica felt comfortable sharing. Slowly but surely, her walls were coming down. She was opening up in ways he hadn't expected, revealing layers of herself that only made him more determined to help her. Tonight, he brought chili and cornbread from his favorite diner, along with a thermos of tea spiced with cinnamon and cloves. As he approached their usual spot, he saw Veronica standing, her thin figure illuminated by the dim glow of a nearby street lamp. She looked up at him, and for the first time, he noticed a softness in her gaze that hadn't been there before, a small flicker of trust. "You're early," he remarked, smiling as he handed her the food. She shrugged, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "I thought I'd beat you for once," she replied, accepting the bag. Her hands had begun to lose their perpetual tremor, and she no longer glanced nervously at passers-by, as if for the first time she felt safe in his presence. They sat together in their usual spot, the silence between them now comfortable, filled with an unspoken understanding. Veronica took a few bites of the chili, her face lighting up as she tasted it. "This is good," she mumbled between bites, glancing at him with something resembling gratitude. "Best chili in town," he replied, watching her with a warm smile. "I thought you'd like it." After a few minutes, Veronica set her spoon down, her gaze growing distant. She was clearly deep in thought, and Nathaniel sensed that something was weighing heavily on her. "What's on your mind?" he asked gently, trying to draw her out without pressuring her. She hesitated, biting her lip as she looked down at her hands. "Nathaniel," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "there's something I haven't told you." Nathaniel's heart skipped a beat, but he kept his face calm, waiting for her to continue. He sensed this was something important, a truth she had been carrying with her and was finally ready to share. "You don't have to tell me anything you're not comfortable with," he reassured her, giving her the space to decide. Veronica took a deep breath, her gaze fixed on the ground. "I haven't been completely honest about my past," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I told you about my mom, about how she got sick and everything, but I didn't tell you about my dad." Nathaniel felt a wave of surprise. She had never mentioned her father before, and from the way she'd spoken about her past, he had assumed he was out of the picture. "He left when I was little," she continued, her voice strained with emotion. "I never knew him growing up, and my mom never talked about him. It was just the two of us for as long as I can remember." She paused, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "But when she got sick, she told me. She told me who he was." Nathaniel leaned forward, listening intently. "Who is he?" Veronica looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger, sadness, and something that looked like betrayal. He's someone important, someone with money, influence, a CEO of some big company." I didn't believe her at first, but she showed me pictures, letters he'd written to her before he disappeared. She told me she didn't want anything to do with him, that she could raise me on her own. And she did, until she couldn't anymore. Nathaniel felt a shock of recognition ripple through him, and a name formed in his mind. Do you know his name?" he asked cautiously, his voice barely above a whisper. Veronica nodded, her expression hardening. "It's Arthur Warren, CEO of Warren Enterprises." She looked away, her jaw clenched. "I'm the daughter of one of the wealthiest men in the city, and he has no idea I exist. Or if he does, he clearly doesn't care." Nathaniel's mind spun, his memories racing back to the many meetings and events he'd attended on behalf of the law firm. Arthur Warren was a name he knew well, a prominent figure in the corporate world, renowned for his business acumen, wealth, and influence. But Warren had always been a private man, keeping his personal life hidden from public view. Nathaniel had no idea he had a daughter, let alone one who was homeless and alone on the streets. He looked at Veronica, a newfound respect mingling with sadness in his gaze. Have you ever tried to reach out to him?" he asked gently. Veronica shook her head, her expression fierce. "Why would I? He abandoned us. My mom was the only family I had, and he left her to raise me alone. He didn't want us then, so why would he care now?" She paused, her eyes flashing with resentment. "Besides, I'm not some charity case. I don't want his money. I just wanted to know why he didn't want me. Why he didn't care enough to be there for us." Nathaniel felt a wave of sadness for her, understanding now the full depth of the pain she carried. Her anger wasn't just at her father. It was at a world that had abandoned her, that had left her with nothing but questions and heartache. "Veronica," he said softly, "I can't imagine what you've been through, or how it must feel to carry this on your own. But you're not alone anymore. I'm here for you, and I want to help you, however I can." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to determine whether he truly meant it. Slowly, her defenses lowered, and she nodded, a faint glimmer of hope in her gaze. "Maybe I've been stubborn," she admitted quietly. "Maybe I should try to find answers, even if it's just to find closure." Nathaniel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his expression filled with empathy. "If that's what you want, I'll support you. I know it's not easy, but you deserve to know the truth. And you have every right to confront him, to ask him why he made the choices he did." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of her decision settling around them. Nathaniel felt a surge of determination. He would stand by her, help her navigate whatever lay ahead. But he also knew that this journey would require more than just his support. Confronting Arthur Warren, a man of immense power and influence, would be no simple task. After a while, Veronica looked up, her gaze steady. I think I'd like to try," she said softly, her voice filled with resolve. "But I don't know where to start." Nathaniel nodded, his mind already racing with ideas. "I can help with that. We'll take it one step at a time. We don't have to rush. We'll move at whatever pace you're comfortable with." She looked at him, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Thank you, Nathaniel, for everything. I don't know why you care, but I'm glad you do." He smiled back, his heart swelling with pride and affection. "I care because you're worth caring about, Veronica. And no matter what happens, I'll be right here." They finished their meal in silence, the weight of the truth between them heavy but no longer unbearable. For the first time, Veronica seemed lighter, as if sharing her secret had lifted a burden she had been carrying alone for too long. Nathaniel felt a deep sense of purpose, knowing that he was walking this path with her, helping her find the answers she needed. As they stood to leave, Veronica looked at him, her expression filled with gratitude and trust. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked, her voice tentative but hopeful. He nodded, his smile reassuring. "Same time, and if you ever change your mind, if you want to talk or make a plan, just let me know." She nodded, her gaze steady, a newfound strength in her eyes. For the first time, she seemed to believe that she wasn't alone in this journey, that someone was willing to stand beside her, no matter how difficult the road ahead might be. As he walked home that night, Nathaniel felt a sense of purpose unlike anything he'd ever known. Veronica was no longer just a girl he was helping. She was a friend, a young woman with an extraordinary spirit, and he was determined to help her find the closure and justice she deserved. Confronting the past. The next few days passed in a blur of cautious planning and tentative hope. Every evening, Nathaniel and Veronica would meet in their usual spot, but the conversations had shifted. Veronica had finally shared her truth, and with that revelation came a new energy, a sense of purpose mixed with a touch of dread. She wanted answers, but the idea of confronting her father, a man she had only heard about in whispered stories from her mother, was terrifying. Nathaniel, sensing her apprehension, approached the situation delicately. He spent hours outside of work researching Arthur Warren, digging up information that could help Veronica understand who her father was. Every bit of information he uncovered painted a complex portrait. Arthur Warren was a successful businessman, yes, but he was also known for his ruthless ambition, his reluctance to reveal any personal details to the media, and his carefully guarded private life. Nothing about his public image hinted at a man with a daughter on the streets, yet Nathaniel felt certain that this secret was hidden in plain sight. Finally, one evening, Nathaniel arrived with a thick envelope of documents he had assembled. He placed the envelope between them, looking at Veronica with a reassuring smile. "This is everything I could find," he explained, his voice calm and steady. "It's mostly public records, news articles, some background on his company, but there are some things about his personal life too. It's not much, but I thought it might help." Veronica stared at the envelope as though it were a forbidden object, a bridge she wasn't sure she was ready to cross. Slowly, she reached out and took it, her fingers trembling slightly. She glanced up at Nathaniel, her face a mixture of gratitude and fear. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely audible. I don't know what I'll find, but I need to know." Nathaniel nodded, his expression filled with empathy. "Whatever you find, remember that it doesn't define you, Veronica. You're strong, and you're worthy, regardless of his choices." She gave him a faint smile, one that quickly faded as she opened the envelope and began to sift through the papers. Nathaniel watched as her face shifted from curiosity to shock, to anger, and finally, to a strange, quiet resignation. She set one particular article aside, a news clipping about her father's latest business acquisition, featuring a photo of Arthur Warren himself, standing on a stage, looking every bit the powerful CEO. "He doesn't look like I imagined," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought he'd look different, warmer, but he just looks cold." Nathaniel glanced at the photo, seeing what she meant. Arthur Warren's expression was stern, almost detached, as if the world around him held little interest beyond the success of his company. It was a face hardened by years of ambition, with no hint of warmth or softness. Nathaniel couldn't imagine that face filled with kindness or fatherly affection. Veronica continued to study the papers, her brow furrowed as she processed the information. After a while, she looked up at Nathaniel, determination shining in her eyes. "I want to meet him," she declared, her voice stronger than he'd ever heard it. "I don't care if he rejects me. I need to look him in the eye and ask him why he left, why he never came for me, even after Mom died." Nathaniel nodded, understanding the weight of her decision. "I'll be with you every step of the way. But are you sure you're ready for this?" Veronica took a deep breath, her gaze unwavering. "Yes, I need to do this, even if it hurts. I need closure, and I deserve answers." They spent the next several days preparing. Nathaniel made discreet calls, using his connections to secure an appointment with Arthur Warren's office, under the guise of business. He made it clear that he wasn't seeking a confrontation, but rather a private meeting. After days of tense waiting, they finally received a response. Arthur Warren's assistant confirmed a time, making it clear that Mr. Warren's schedule was tight and that he rarely entertained personal matters. The night before the meeting, Veronica was quiet, her usual reserved demeanor replaced by something deeper, a vulnerability that she tried to mask but couldn't fully hide. Nathaniel watched her, feeling a mixture of pride and concern. He wanted to protect her from the pain he knew this encounter could bring, but he also knew that she was stronger than she appeared. "Are you sure you're ready?" he asked one last time as they sat on the bench in their familiar spot. Veronica looked up at him, her expression firm. "I've spent too long avoiding this," she said quietly. "Whatever happens tomorrow, at least I'll know I tried. I owe it to myself and to my mom." Nathaniel nodded, feeling the surge of admiration for her. "I'm proud of you, Veronica. No matter what happens, you're not alone in this." She gave him a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, Nathaniel. I don't know what I would have done without you." The next day, dawned cold and gray, with a biting wind that seemed to mirror the tension building in both of them. They arrived at Warren Enterprises headquarters, a sleek, glass skyscraper that loomed over the city like a fortress. The receptionist eyed them with a professional indifference as they checked in, directing them to the executive floor with a brief nod. Veronica's grip tightened on Nathaniel's arm as they stepped into the elevator, her face pale but resolute. Nathaniel placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, offering silent support as they rode to the top floor. When the elevator doors opened, they were greeted by Arthur Warren's assistant, a polished woman with a tight bun and an expression of carefully concealed curiosity. She led them to a large, luxurious office, furnished with minimalist decor that reflected Warren's no-nonsense personality. A vast window spanned the wall behind the desk, offering a panoramic view of the city below. Arthur Warren stood by the window, his back to them as they entered. He was a tall man with silver-streaked hair, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that exuded authority. He didn't turn around immediately, but Nathaniel could sense the tension in his posture, as though he already knew that this was more than a business meeting. Finally, Warren turned to face them, his expression guarded as he looked from Nathaniel to Veronica. His eyes lingered on her, a flicker of recognition passing over his face before it quickly vanished. He maintained a carefully composed demeanor, but Nathaniel could see the faint lines of discomfort etched into his features. "To what do I owe this unexpected visit?" Warren asked, his voice cold and detached. Veronica stepped forward, her hands trembling but her gaze steady. "I'm here because I need answers," she said, her voice filled with quiet strength. "I'm Veronica, your daughter." Warren's face remained unreadable, though Nathaniel noticed a slight twitch in his jaw. He crossed his arms, his expression inscrutable as he looked down at her. "I see," he replied after a long pause. His tone was controlled, almost dismissive. "And what exactly is it that you want from me?" Veronica swallowed, her eyes flashing with a mixture of anger and hurt. "I don't want your money, if that's what you're thinking. I don't want anything from you, except the truth. I want to know why you abandoned us, why you left my mom to raise me alone, why you never came back, even after she died." Warren's gaze flickered, a hint of something that might have been regret crossing his face, though it was gone in an instant. "Your mother made her choice," he replied, his voice carefully neutral. "She didn't want me in her life, and I respected that. As for you, I didn't know you existed until it was too late." Veronica's eyes filled with tears, though she blinked them back, refusing to let him see her vulnerability. "You knew about me eventually. You could have come for me, could have helped when I was alone, but you chose not to." Warren's expression softened, if only for a moment. "I won't deny that I made mistakes. I should have done more, perhaps, but I thought it was best to stay away. I had responsibilities, a career. I didn't think I was needed." Veronica took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I don't need anything from you now," she said firmly, her voice filled with a quiet strength. "I came here because I needed closure. I needed to know why you weren't there, why you left me to face everything alone. And now, I have my answer." Warren's face betrayed a flicker of surprise, as if he hadn't expected her to be so resolute. For a moment, it seemed as though he might reach out, as though he might offer something, an apology, perhaps, or an expression of regret. But instead, he remained silent, his gaze distant and impassive. Veronica turned to Nathaniel, her face filled with a newfound determination. She no longer looked like the fragile girl he had met on the street. She looked like someone who had reclaimed a part of herself, someone who had faced her past and emerged stronger. "Let's go," she said quietly, her voice steady. Nathaniel nodded, placing a comforting arm around her shoulders as they left the office, leaving Arthur Warren standing alone, his expression unreadable. As they stepped out of the building and into the cold air, Veronica took a deep breath, her shoulders relaxing as though a weight had been lifted from them. "Are you okay?" Nathaniel asked, his voice filled with concern. She nodded, a small smile breaking through her tears. I am now. I think I can finally move on." And as they walked away from the towering building, Nathaniel knew that Veronica had found something far more valuable than her father's acknowledgement. She had found her own strength, her own resilience. She had confronted her past, and now she was free to shape her own future, unburdened by the shadows that had once haunted her. Finding a new path. The confrontation with her father had left Veronica exhausted yet unburdened, a strange mixture of liberation and sadness swirling within her. She had gained closure, but it had come at a cost. In facing the man who had abandoned her, she'd been forced to acknowledge a painful truth. She would never have the family she had dreamed of, the father who would have cared for her. Arthur Warren was little more than a stranger, a man bound to her by blood, but devoid of any real connection. And that realization, while painful, had also set her free. In the days that followed, Nathaniel noticed a change in her. She seemed lighter, more open to discussing her future rather than lingering on her past. For so long, Veronica's life had been defined by survival, by an endless cycle of trying to get by, day by day. Now, for the first time, she was beginning to imagine something beyond her present circumstances, a life where she had agency, where she could build something new. One crisp evening, as they sat together in the park, sharing a bag of takeout, Veronica looked at him with a thoughtful expression. "Nathaniel, do you think it's possible for someone like me to start over?" He looked at her, his heart swelling with pride and hope. "Of course, Veronica. I think you're stronger than most people I know. You've been through more than anyone should ever have to endure, and you're still standing. That kind of strength doesn't just disappear." She smiled, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "I don't feel strong. Most days, I feel like I'm barely hanging on." "Maybe that's what strength really is," he replied, his voice soft. "You've held on, even when it would have been easier to give up. That takes courage." She looked down, her fingers tracing patterns on the bench. "I want to be different, Nathaniel. I want to be someone who doesn't just survive, but actually lives." He nodded, understanding the depth of her longing. "What do you want to do? Have you thought about what kind of life you'd like to build?" She hesitated, then spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't really know. I've never allowed myself to think about it. Dreams felt dangerous. They were something other people had, people who didn't have to worry about where they'd sleep or when they'd eat." Nathaniel felt a pang of sadness, but he didn't let it show. Instead, he leaned in, his tone encouraging. "Well, it's never too late to start. We can take it slow. Think about the things you like, the things that bring you joy. What makes you feel alive?" She thought about his question for a long moment, her brow furrowed in concentration. "I guess I always loved art," she said, almost shyly. "When I was little, my mom and I used to go to the art museum. She couldn't afford to buy me supplies, but I'd borrow pencils and paper from school and draw everything I saw." Nathaniel's eyes lit up, a smile spreading across his face. "Art. That's a beautiful passion, Veronica. Have you thought about pursuing it? Maybe taking classes?" Her face clouded with uncertainty. "I don't know if I'm good enough. It's been so long since I really tried. And classes, they cost money. I don't have any of that." He reached into his bag and pulled out a small sketchbook and a set of pencils he'd picked up on a whim, hoping to encourage her in some way. "I thought you might say that," he said, handing them to her. "It's a start. No strings attached, no expectations, just you and whatever you want to create." Veronica stared at the sketchbook in her lap, her hands trembling slightly as she ran her fingers over the cover. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and wonder. "Thank you, Nathaniel," she whispered. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," he replied warmly. "Just promise me you'll try." In the days that followed, Veronica found herself drawn to the sketchbook. She'd slip it out in the quiet moments, letting the world around her fade as she filled the pages with shapes and lines, her hand moving almost as if guided by something beyond her control. Art became her refuge, a place where she could process the emotions she had carried for so long. She sketched everything: memories of her mother's face, scenes from the city streets, imagined landscapes she had never seen but longed to visit. Nathaniel could see the difference it made in her. She began to smile more, her laughter becoming less rare, and her posture grew more confident, less weighed down by the burdens she had carried. It was as if each drawing was lifting a piece of her past, allowing her to step forward without the chains of what had once held her back. One evening, as they sat together on their familiar park bench, she handed him the sketchbook, her eyes filled with a mixture of pride and nervousness. "I thought you might want to see what I've been working on." Nathaniel took the sketchbook from her, flipping through the pages slowly. His eyes widened with admiration as he took in the intricacy and depth of each drawing. Her talent was undeniable. Her lines were precise yet expressive, her shading nuanced, capturing emotion in every stroke. It was as if she had poured her heart onto the pages, each drawing a piece of her soul made visible. "These are incredible, Veronica," he said, his voice filled with awe. "You have a gift. Truly." She blushed, looking away. "Thank you," she murmured. I didn't think they were anything special. It's just something I do to cope, I guess." "It's more than that," he insisted, looking at her with genuine admiration. "You have a talent that deserves to be nurtured. Have you thought about showing these to someone? Maybe applying to an art program or finding a mentor?" Her eyes widened, her face a mixture of excitement and disbelief. "You really think I could do that?" "Absolutely," he replied, his tone unwavering. "If it's what you want, I'll help you find the right opportunities. There are scholarships, grants, lots of ways to make it happen. All you have to do is say yes." She took a deep breath, considering his words. It was clear she was both thrilled and terrified by the idea, but he could see the spark of hope in her eyes, a light that had been absent for so long. Finally, she nodded, her expression determined. "I want to try. I don't know if I'll be good enough, but I want to see what's possible." They spent the next few weeks preparing a portfolio, selecting her best sketches and organizing them carefully. Nathaniel connected her with a local art instructor who offered mentorship to young artists, and together they worked on refining her technique and helping her understand the world of art beyond what she had known. Veronica threw herself into the work, her passion and dedication unmatched, and for the first time in her life, she felt like she was part of something meaningful, something that was truly her own. Her application to a local art school was accepted, and when the letter arrived, she ran to find Nathaniel, her face alight with excitement and disbelief. "I got in," she exclaimed, thrusting the acceptance letter toward him. "They want me. They actually want me." Nathaniel laughed, pulling her into a hug, his heart swelling with pride. "Of course they want you, Veronica. You're incredible." As the days passed and she prepared for her classes, Veronica's confidence blossomed. Her encounters with Nathaniel became less frequent, not because they had drifted apart, but because she was finally building her own life. She began spending her evenings at the studio, losing herself in her art, surrounded by peers who shared her passion. She made friends, found mentors, and felt a sense of belonging she had never known before. One evening, after finishing her work at the studio, she met Nathaniel for dinner. As they sat across from each other, he looked at her with a proud smile. "You've come so far, Veronica," he said, his voice filled with warmth. "It's like you're a whole new person." She smiled back, her eyes shining. "I feel like a new person. I'm not just existing anymore. I'm living." They sat in comfortable silence, savoring the moment. Veronica had transformed before his eyes, shedding the pain and uncertainty that had once defined her. She was still the girl he had met on the street, but now she was something more, an artist, a student, a young woman with a future that was hers to shape. Before they parted ways that evening, she reached out and took his hand, looking at him with a seriousness that surprised him. "Thank you, Nathaniel," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't think I'll ever be able to repay you for everything you've done for me. You gave me hope when I didn't have any." He squeezed her hand gently, smiling. "You don't owe me anything, Veronica. All I ever wanted was to see you happy, to see you living the life you deserve. And you're doing that now. That's all the thanks I need." As they walked in opposite directions that night, Veronica felt a profound sense of gratitude and closure. She had faced her past, found her path, and discovered a family in the form of a friend who had believed in her when she couldn't believe in herself. And as she looked ahead to her future, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she was ready to face them, no longer alone, but stronger than ever.